Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Papers Podcast. We go through the health professions education literature and make sense of it to help you make sense of your day. I'm here today with the usual cast of characters. Hi, Linda.
Hi there.
Hi, John.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for listening.
And Jason, today you found a particularly unusual, I'll just say weird paper for us. Would you like to justify the selection at all?
I'd love to. So hi, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. So I look for papers that are completely unlike Lara's, like something interesting and different, basically, or useful.
Snap.
Sometimes a good method. So different papers. Anyway, so I went looking for different titles. I look at different journals. I tried really hard not to choose a paper from academic medicine because I'm pretty heavily weighted to that. And so this one is, this one's definitely different. I think you all would agree. I'll set it up for us and then I'll ask people to weigh in whether they think it's an important topic. I called this episode The Call of the Crowd, Why Attend Health Professions Education Conferences. So the title of the paper is Cliques Within the Crowd, Identifying Medical Conference Attendee Subgroups by Their Motivations for Participation.
Is it clique or clique?
Oh,
I thought it was clique.
You can do both.
Definite clique.
Clique.
No,
It
definite
is
clique.
cliques.
No,
Yep.
Unless you're from
Jason,
Northern
that's
Ontario.
three against one.
Okay, go ahead. While I'm talking, go ahead and Google it. You'll see. Click. Anyway, in fact, a few clicks away, you'll find the right pronunciation.
Oh,
Boom.
Not
Okay, the
boom.
lead author is Ram. I do want to give out a couple of shout outs. Kevin Eva, one of our meta gurus here in Canada at UBC, and Soren Huendijk, who is a good friend from Switzerland. He's the senior author on this paper. This paper's in advances. So what are we talking about? Every year, thousands of nurses, physicians, researchers, other health professionals of all stripes get time off work, buy plane tickets, get jet lag, stay in cheap hotels, get sciatica from bad airplane seats, eat rubber chicken, drink bad coffee, and seek out their colleagues at conferences. So is this an addiction to PowerPoint karaoke, I ask? Or is this loneliness for someone who understands the same arcane theories that only 3 other people in the world really care about? Is this a chance to wear those shoes you've always wanted to wear in Europe? Apropos, Lara's visit to Glasgow, I'm just saying.
Shoes?
However, there's totally about the shoes. You're all going on and on about the shoes.
Can I play a sound for you right now?
Yeah.
Are you ready?
Yeah.
Hold on, I should put it over here.
Cliques.
Deal with that reality. Clique.
That's one interpretation. So anyway, what are we talking about? We're talking about conferences. So there is a subgenre of research that looks specifically at meetings of professions and industry representatives. Most of that literature is outside of health professionals. This work usually highlights that conferences are a powerful way to disseminate innovations and facilitate connections across scholars and practitioners. Here's a list of the big motivations for going to conferences. I'm going to ask you guys in a minute, why do you go to conferences? So the first is present work and get feedback. The second is facilitate collaborative work. Number 3 is to advance personal learning. Number 4 is face-to-face discussions with colleagues. Number 5 is networking. Number 6 is tourism. And number 7 is because they had the finances to do so. This is from the literature from various papers. So John, Linda, Lara, why do you go to health professions education conferences?
I guess it depends which type of conference. For in-person, it's almost always for the networking and then for some administration, which I didn't see on your list. But for me, there's often a meeting that's going to be held in conjunction with the conference. For virtual, I might go to learn, but there it's often in a content domain of which I'm a relative novice. And so I'm finding stuff that's outside of a regular conference I'm going to. And so those virtual conferences are often the one-offs. I'll go and see this for a little bit, whereas the in-person are usually on the calendar as this is the place I go, or this is the conference I go, perhaps in a different place on an annualized basis.
so I think it's almost exactly, for me, it's exactly the same as John, with the addition that, of course, I go to see you 3 at conferences and hang out together, and depending on where we are, drink whiskey or nice wine or whatever. So that's part of it. I also go sometimes as, I guess I'd call it as a sponsor. I'm taking a graduate student or a resident, they may be presenting something, so I'm going to support them.
That's a good point, Linda.
Yeah. And by the way, it's rare that at some of the conferences within my area of expertise, and I think I've heard Jason and John say the same thing. It's rare that I actually am going to learn something. Sometimes I do, but that's not the main reason.
I go to conferences for many of the same reasons. One is often as a sponsor, Linda, like you, I'll either have graduate students who are presenting, or I'll have a junior faculty member who's looking for a job, or someone who's looking to make connections with specific individuals they've never met. And so my work at conferences is often in meetings trying to help those junior faculty members, those junior scholars find their voice, find their position, find a connection. The other reason I go to these conferences, like you, there's often business meetings that I'm attending or something like that I need to be at. But the other part is, as you highlighted, Linda, it's for the relationships. A lot of the people I work with, I'm at a point in my career now where I only work with people I think are fun and I like them and I want to be their friend and we're going to have fun together. So if I'm going to a conference, my schedule outside of those other purposes is full of just getting to hang out with people I like.
That's awesome. You forgot to mention good food. The other thing...
That's why Linda's there, right? Linda's the
right.
foodie.
Linda,
she can hook us up.
So the other one that I would just throw on the table is talent spotting. So if you're a leader in health professions education, you might be organizing networks or studies or other conferences. And so sometimes you go into a meeting, you find somebody who's just got a great idea that everybody needs to hear. So you can give a platform for them.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's go back.
Part of talent spotting is also, they may have a great idea, but can they present it? So you go to see what they're like in real life.
Sure. Yeah, for sure. So here's what the authors are pitching to us, that the COVID pandemic slammed conferences, forcing dramatic and desperate changes. Some meetings became virtual, some ceased to exist. Those that returned found that their costs doubled and their attendees demanded hybrid options. The authors of this paper pitch that conference organizers and just professionals in general would benefit from new post-pandemic insights into conference attendees' motivations for attending. And this paper is part of a PhD thesis. So, like I said, this paper is from Advances in Health Science Education, 2023. First author is Ram. They set out to characterize the motivations of attendees to MedEd conferences and whether there are distinct subgroups of attendees. So there's a few things in this paper I think all of us are going to agree are just a little bit different or not what maybe most people would say or how they organized it. And maybe one of them is the way they threw out their rationale for this paper. I'm wondering if you agree in a few seconds. This study was part of a PhD thesis and sponsored by the European Respiratory Society. So I'm going to describe the methods to you, and then I'll take another pause and get people's input. The author said they selected a, quote, pragmatic constructivist case study approach using mixed methods. And listeners to our podcasts recall that we previously discussed case studies as an in-depth examination of a small number of instances, and they can be done for a variety of reasons using a variety of methods, but the phenomena is always in real-life context. So that's sort of the characteristics of a case study. So this setting was, quote, a large-scale virtual medical conference of 29,000 attendees from many countries. And so this is the European Respiratory Society conference. The two methods used were initially a series of interviews of conference organizers. So they had a definition of that. And they used stimulus from previous literature about why people go to conferences. And then they surveyed attendees using the interviews as a stimulus to make the items. And Tony Artino's guide to design. So there you go. There's a shout out to Tony Artino. Analysis used Braun and Clark's 6-phase thematic approach. Codes were identified, discussed, and refined. And then there's a little bit of stats at the end. They're really focused on a quantitative approach to this. A K-means cluster analysis of the survey data was used to identify subgroups. They basically did a factor analysis and then looked for groups. The authors included a reflexivity statement that indicates the author group was a mix of both conference organizers and researchers from outside of the conference. So I'm going to pause there. I'm going to ask Lara, Linda, John for comments on the methods and anything else that struck you of the setup for this paper.
I struggled a little bit with these methods, not because I thought that the survey was inappropriate. I'm fine with that. And I like the way they got some interviews to find out what the issues were and then use that to build the survey. I think, though, that we are at the very limit of what you might potentially want to call mixed methods research. Because in my mind, this isn't mixed methods research. This is the development of a survey. And a good development of a survey starts with some interviews, starts with some lit review. But you wouldn't say that that's mixed methods research that involves qualitative data and a literature review, which then develop the survey. No, that's the background work to the survey.
Yeah.
So, but if you want to call this mixed methods research, technically, maybe we could stretch it that far. But for me, that's one of the things that caught me about these methods, that this is a real stretch. This is a real stretch to call it mixed methods research. The other part is that I really am not confident that the knowledge developed from this clinical conference speaks to the health professions education audience. I think people go to clinical conferences for very different reasons than they go to HPE conferences. I think they are actually really different entities. And so for me, I didn't struggle with the design piece of the survey or anything like that. My problem was with the choice of the environment in which to study to then say these findings are applicable to us in HPE.
Fair enough. Linda?
So I agree. And in fact, earlier on, you said the research question was about med-ed conferences, but it is, in fact, a clinical conference. And I think there's a huge difference. And Lara, I'm glad you picked that up as a non-clinician, but I do go for, there's more knowledge and less networking, I think, if I compare it to med-ed conferences. Other than that, good point about whether this is mixed methods or not. But I thought other than that, the methods were fine.
Okay, John?
5. I love the methods. Loved it.
It must have numbers in it.
Stop.
I did. I thought this was really elegant. I think we're picking at the edges just to find something to critique. I agree.
No.
I can see what you're saying, Varpio.
Picking at the edges. This is not picking at the edges. It's the core issue. Is this context the right one?
They could have reported the interviews that they did with all the subject matter experts about here's what we think in our experience about why they did.
They used it to develop the survey. That's what they did.
This is my airtime.
I agree with Varpio. Keep talking.
So, but they could have. But I think we're picking at the edges whether we're calling this a mixed methods or not. But as they do, they give us a really elegant way. Now, I guess a factor analysis followed by a cluster analysis when you're looking at large data sets, that's not an original type of approach, but we don't see that all the time. And thank God we're not talking about focus groups on this episode. I like how they use this to give us a big generalizable to, I'll admit your point around clinical medicine conferences, because I think it's a different phenomenon, but easily replicable with a conference of a similar size within HPE. So like AME, which has about 4,000 attendees. We can quibble a little bit about their results when we get to that part, but I actually think it's a nice way to look at a large survey and to parse it in a way into these subgroups that give you an understanding of motivation. So it's much more nuanced rather than we don't see a trend, or here's a very black and white description of a whole bunch of different rationales for why we go to conferences. We all heard it in our introduction. We all spoke about, well, it depends if it's virtual or in person, depends where I am at my career. It depends if I'm sponsoring somebody or if I have the cash. It depends who else is going. So those are nuanced things, and they get this survey data and they get a much more nuanced answer than just simply reporting means, demographics, and you don't get anything. So I really like this. My critique of the methods, though, is if you don't know what a factor analysis is, and you don't know what a cluster analysis is, and you don't know why you do one before the other, or you could inverse, you could do the cluster analysis first and then the factor analysis. You won't necessarily have enough data there. They don't have to teach it to you, but enough data there to say, I trust the methods to get me to the results. And that would be the small critique, I would say. Their word count over methods was short.
Very. Okay, so let's get into it. I like how spicy this is getting. So with respect to the results, they report that 13 of 23 conference leaders participated in interviews. The two main themes were identified describing factors that influence conference motivation from these interviews. The first was your depth of specializing in a field leads to seeking focused content over time. So in other words, if you're a novice in the field, you'll just go to generally across the meeting because you just want to keep up. And the thesis was If you get really focused on an area, if you're very expert on an area, you're going to the conference to see that area and meet the colleagues that are working in that area. The second theme from the interviews was engagement with past conferences, like in-depth engagement, leads to shifts to social motivations. You know people at these meetings, so you want to see them, you want to experience their company. So that's what came out of the interviews. So 1,229 people completed the survey. So for a response rate of 4%. So we're going to talk about that maybe a little bit. Most are from Europe. Most were middle-aged men. That probably reflects the demographics. They don't really give you a sensitivity analysis. Motivations themes from the analysis of the responses included sort of three big themes: personal goals, social goals, and learning goals. You can guess what was underneath those umbrellas. And then they did their fancy stats that John was enamored with, and they identified three subgroups. So I'm going to do this as like the simplest, most accessible way possible, just so we can have a conversation about their very elaborate stats. So group one endorsed all three motivations. I go to the conference for all three of those things: personal goals and learning goals and social goals. And that was 41% of the respondents. Group two said basically, this is all about learning. I go to this conference for learning. That's what I do it for. That's 28%. And group three was 15%, endorsed social factors if the conference was face-to-face. It's kind of a contingent answer. And learning if they attend as a virtual conference, which is kind of like what John said off the top. These were the least satisfied by the virtual format that took place the year that the survey was conducted. At the time of the study in 2020, in the middle of the pandemic, 2/3 of respondents preferred a hybrid conference. If people are dying around the world of a pandemic, you might prefer a little bit of virtual in your life. The authors conclude that there were three distinct subgroups that they identified, motivated with these three different factors: personal, social, and learning. And this is all during the pandemic virtual conference era. This can inform future conference planning, is their thesis. So I'd love to hear your reactions to the results and where the authors took this paper. Let's go in the other order. John, Linda, Lara.
I think the potential Achilles heel of the results is whether there's a response bias. With a 4% response, does this reflect in a generalizable way what the experience of a majority of conference attendees? Normally, we're looking for a response rate above 30%, and that falls short. It's a large number of people. It's a large survey, but does it reflect all people that are attending large general medical or specialized medical conferences? So you have to decide whether you can get past that and whether anything else means anything later. The results, I guess, for me, you're right, Jason, it's really hard in the course of a podcast, and they didn't do a great job in terms of how they represented the accumulated data. They had some tables, but you had to get from table 2 to figure 1 and build the own connection in your brain to see what that meant, and then look at the implications. Well, what it does tell us, for me, as somebody who's built large conferences and does small ones, if I'm building a large conference, I'm looking at a subgroup here, that's the majority of respondents, that are going for a whole bunch of reasons: social, personal, and learning. And I would need to make sure that I have a mix of everything. But if I'm thinking about building a boutique conference, I might really say I'm going to hit on the group that wants personal, but in a in-person version, or I'm going to do learning, but in a virtual context. And I'm not going to bother with hybrid either, because I'm going to be dissatisfying 2 of those types of subgroups identified here. And it's not going to be worth the extra administrative and financial costs for doing that. So it gives us a bit of a meta to say, understand who is your target audience potentially. You'd probably have to do your own analysis for HPE. And once you know that, you can figure out, how am I going to build my conference for the future? Because if you just send out at the end of your conference, what'd you like about this, and you get some data back, it's all over the map. It's probably random until you do the analysis that they start to show here. How can I get a bit of simplification of all these variables so that I can see correlations? And then how do I partition the respondents into those groups so I can say, okay, here's all the subgroups that are coming out. Here's how I should interpret it. And that's the beauty of the statistical method.
Wasn't there a point in the results, John, where they said, we did this factor analysis and then we did this statistical analysis. And in the end, we thought that this other thing was logical. There's kind of like a jumping the shark part in the results somewhere. I don't know if you noticed that. Okay. Sorry, go ahead, John.
Yeah, I'm not disagreeing with what you said. There was some chains of the chain of logic at a couple moments. And then some magic happens, and then we did this. But we did this analysis to say that it's sufficient, but we're not going to show you the other analysis because it looks really close.
Exactly. Yeah. Linda, comments?
So, yeah, I've run and developed a whole bunch of conferences, large and small, and being a CPD dean where you do that kind of thing. And this is interesting. I'm not sure it adds anything except for the fact that there are perhaps different numbers of people who go for different reasons, and some go for multiple reasons. I was still left with the so what a bit. Okay, so the so what is somewhat what John said. If it's a hybrid, you're going to concentrate more on learning and less on social, the bigger picture, but not so much the details. If I'm having an in-person conference, I'd like to know what are the things that actually help with the networking or help with the learning? And, this was a much higher level, more theoretical than that. So interesting, but I'm not sure how useful it is.
Okay. Lara.
So the thing that I don't have much to add that's different from what y'all have said, but I have one point. So one thing that irks me a little bit. So this research study answers its research questions. It wants to have information about the motivations of delegates at this medical conference. Fine. At this content. Fine. So yes, they answered their research question. But what this study design and the literature review and the work that they do here in this study don't take into consideration is that conferences are offered by organizations and that organizations have agendas. Organizations have priorities, and those priorities underpin all the decisions that happen when we look at conference design. What topics did the organization committee think were important? That's what you're going to hear about at the plenary. How important is skill building? That's how many workshops you're going to get. How important is it to have the latest research highlighted? That's how many abstract podiums or podium presentations you're going to have. So this study gives us insight into the motivations of the attendees at this conference. Sure. Is that applicable to HPE? I'm not convinced, but they answered their research question. But let's remember that the organization bodies that stand behind these conferences are making available certain motivations. The conference organizers, those organizational decisions, those agendas, set the priorities. They make available what you can do. So for instance, social activism was not mentioned by any of these participants as motivations. But that's in part because the conference organization, the conference agenda is not to enable social activism. So I have a little bit of a problem with the study not taking that into consideration because the motivations you're hearing about are a direct result of what's available to the participants to engage in. So then to say that we should use this information to design conferences, well, what you're actually doing is saying we should copy the agendas of these organizations. And I'm not sure about that.
To just add to that, particularly, there are some parts of the world where sponsors, exhibitors, whatever, also have an influence on the conference organizers, and not so much in other places where there are quote-unquote ethical guidelines. But that will also influence content.
Okay. I thought this was a funny paper, and I get it that somebody's PhD thesis is looking at this European Respiratory Society meeting and trying to really learn about it. So it's a case study. What I wanted to know was probably only accessible through different methods. I'd love to have people interview attendees and get really in depth and really understand why do they go to these meetings and what is it about them they find useful and what are the pitfalls, what's missing. And I just think there's a lot that's missing from the literature that has not yet been harvested because that methodology has not been used and those types of questions have not yet been asked. So there you go, listeners. Now you have an opportunity. Somebody needs to do a big qualitative study of conference meetings. At least I'm not aware of one. Maybe someone else here is. So I thought that was missing. So there you go. There you have it. The authors said that there are 3 distinct subgroups of attendees at pandemic virtual clinical conferences with lessons for health professions education conferences going forward. So do you agree? Does this inform future conferences? Do the themes that are identified by these authors make sense to you? Is sort of the question I would have for people listening. So let's do a quick round of super scientific votes, much reflective of, the kinds of scores you'd make at a conference as you evaluate sessions. So Lara, play along nicely. So let's go do methods for this paper. Lara, Linda, John. Lara's got this really mischievous look on her face.
I knew you were going to pick me first. So on a Likert scale of 1 to 7, where the anchors
Out of 5.
are anchored by my feelings, I'm going to put this paper at the middle of the pack, because I'm going to give it a 3. Because if you think that the context that they studies is applicable, then the findings will resonate for you. If you don't think that the context is HPE relevant and speaks to our context, then it's not going to be useful to you. If you think that the motivations are sufficiently nuanced to capture the role that the organizational decisions play in all of this, then maybe you'd give it a bit more. So I think it really depends on how you want to interpret those decisions. So I'm going to give it a 3, middle of the pack.
Linda, then John.
So I can't say I know a lot about the statistics that are described here, but let's assume that they were the right thing to do and look at the rest of it. It did. They used some methods that answered the questions. I had the same concern about the response rate, and they don't say anything about how they could have increased the response rate. So probably good methods, but middle of the pack for me, 3.
Okay, John.
I took a bit of rhetorical license earlier on with 555. I'm actually going to give it 4. I think the way they designed their survey informed in that sequential fashion, and then the way they did the analysis, moving past the typical descriptive and trying to show very high level comparison amongst some survey items, I think that is a level of rigor. And I would be a call to other researchers using a similar survey methodology to look to say, you can advance the quality of your survey design and subsequent analysis.
John's reading a different paper than I am. I actually think this is a 2. The methods lost me. Sure, they did questionnaire design. They quoted Tony Artino, which, it's like a gold standard to point to paper. But they kind of lost me in the analysis. The response rate was really small. There was no sensitivity analysis. So I just, they lost me in the method. So I'm going to give it a 2.
Can I get a point of order? Are you supposed to present papers where you actually think they're bad? Is that like sandbagging? Is that too much?
It's not about whether they're good or bad, John. It's about what we can learn from them.
Well,
Okay.
And also we haven't heard Jason's next rating, which may in fact mean that he really thinks it's good, even though the stats are bad.
Exactly. A little foreshadowing. Okay, so let's do impact. Let's go Linda, John, Lara.
I'm going to give this a 3. I think it's interesting, the findings. I'm not sure it's new, although maybe the fact that we should concentrate a little bit more on knowledge in virtual conferences might be something. So we know what, but we don't know how. And I would have loved to have heard a little bit more about that. So again, maybe a slightly different methodology or an expansion of the survey. What can we do to make it better for you? How can we make it better? Would have helped me. Will it change my practice? I don't think so.
Okay, John.
I'm struggling here as my enthusiasm for their methodology is not matched for the findings. I'm struggling to decide whether I'm going to be generous and give it a 2 or give it a 1. And I'm struggling with the response bias, whether I can make sense of everything else there. And then the work of a health professions educator to translate the specifics into the meta-analysis of this is how you could just think about making sure that you understand the different groups and how those different groups will get ported or cluster to certain variables in the design of your conference. And so I think it can give us that big meta message. And so for that, I'll give it a 2. That's a lot of reading just to get that meta message. I could have taken that as a brief editorial.
Okay. And Lara.
So I'm having the same struggle, John, between a 1 and a 2, and I'm going to end on the other side. I'm going to give it a 1. I think this is a confirmatory study of some of the things we know about large scientific meetings. I'm not sure it speaks to HPE. I'm not sure it speaks to all of the different motivations we might actually have that may not be motivations that are currently offered by different organizations.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that I'm not sure that these, like I sit on, as many of us do, sit on conference planning boards. I'm not sure that these findings are findings that I would bring to them. So unfortunately for me, this one's a 1.
All right. And unfortunately, I'm going to agree with Lara, which is shocking to everybody I know. But in this case, I agree. So no offense to the authors. I think they did an amazing amount of work. I just don't think it changes my practice. So just before we go, as a special treat to our listeners, I have a question for each of you. And that is, would you be willing to share one memory which stands out in your mind from a med-ed conference you've gone to in your career? Now, I know there's decades of memories there, but I'd like to hear something that stands out, and maybe you could tell us it was a big conference, little conference, something like that. And here's the order we're going to go in. John, Linda.
Thanks for making me go first and rattle my memory for something. What did I have for breakfast? Well, I got a good one. I have a memory in 2008 or 2009. I knew where we did the planning for this. It was the inaugural International Conference on Residency Education. The prior year, Jason and I went to the Royal College conference, and I sat in the crowd and saying, what is happening? What kind of parody? What kind of parody am I experiencing? And then subsequent to that, Jason went on and developed ICRE, which has been running since 2008 or 9. You'll have to correct me on the exact date. And both Linda and I have been previously co-chairs. None of us are involved with the conference at this time. That conference was a stark contrast prior to the advent on that year, but continues to me to be what I thought was a real groundbreaker in HPE in terms of the themes tackled, who was present in decision-making, and how it was a broad community, the quality of the actual presentation and the production value, and then the way that there's a lot of informative opportunity for networking and profiling of various voices. And so I think other conferences I've looked to ICRE and have captured some of that, but that was that A/B testing at that transition was pretty significant for me.
Cool. Linda?
So I think back to one of the Ottawa Conference on Assessment in Health Professions Education. And I don't remember, it was in Ottawa. I don't remember whether it was the first one or the second one in Ottawa. So a good 10, 12, even more years ago. And what I remember is the OSCE, okay, like an OSCE, but as the objective, structured, wining and dining exam. It was developed by Ian Hart, who was, I think, the chair of the conference and was a wonderful foodie and wino. And so it was the best way. Yes, it was fun, Jason, I see you're laughing. But there were a lot of people who still, before then, didn't get what OSCEs were for and didn't get how to run them. And after that, it was a perfect model of a simulation of an OSCE that was generalizable. So there you go. That's my memory.
I love the memory. It was the term I was reacting to.
So the memory that I'll share, it maybe it's more of a reflection. I've had the honor of being the chair of the AAMC's, the Association of American Medical Colleges Medical Education Planning Committee, for their annual meeting, the Learn, Serve, Lead meeting. And I've been the chair for several years now. And the memory that I have in working on that committee is the level of appreciation I have gained for the sheer volume of volunteer hours that are required by thousands of people to make any conference run, because every abstract needs to have 3 reviews, and somebody needs to sit down with all of the abstracts and all of the reviews and make a decision about what gets in and what doesn't. And that you are only given so many slots in the program, and you only have so many minutes for each presentation, and so on and so forth. And a set of somebodies has to invest a lot of time and money and energy to make that happen. And a lot of it is actually volunteer work from community members. And so for me, I could tell you about talks that I've given where I was just so thrilled with how it was received. I could give you examples of watching some of my learners give amazing talks and win awards, and those are really memorable. But as somebody who's been working on the other side of these conferences for so many years, shout out to all of our listeners who volunteer to do this work so that we can have these meetings. Without an army of volunteers, none of it would happen. None of it would happen.
Cool. Since it's my hosted paper, I'm going to take the privilege of giving you 3 really quick ones. The first was ACGME meeting where Ken Ludmerer, who's an author, a historian of medical education in the U.S., and whose books I really admire, gave a keynote and had this anecdote. He said, when I was an internal medicine resident, being on call was really intense. We would admit 5 people a week, and then they'd stay for a month, and the whole crowd fell upon themselves because it's so intense now. The second thing I was going to share was the most amazing, generative, hotly debated yet collegial conversation I've ever been a part of was the first ICBME meeting in Ottawa, where we were debating what is CBME. That took a day with 30 people from around the world. Ron Harden, Eric Hombo, and other giants admit it. That one was magical. But the funniest thing I've ever seen at a conference that's so memorable is I gave a keynote speech in the Middle East. This conference was a high-level conference. It was opened by one of the princes, and there was very elaborate furniture up on the stage. Well, after the prince was done and I was halfway through my plenary, the prince's team came and took his furniture back, including the podium I was at. I had to grab the mic to keep going, and that was a fantastic experience. So there you go, everybody. On that note, we thank you for listening to the Papers Podcast. We'd love to hear your opinion about this paper, about John's ratings, Lara's ideas. If you can spell the word epistemology and the correct way to pronounce the word click.
Click.
Because you know I'm right. So there you go. And we really appreciate you listening to us and suggesting papers and writing to us. So please do so at thepaperspodcast@gmail.com. Our website is paperspodcast.com. Is that right, John? There you go. I'll never get that right. On that note,
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening.
Lara, say goodbye.
Oh, there's a mute button on here. I pressed that.
Samuel.
Well, shut the front door.
Samuel, you feel me, do you? Do you feel
Talk
me?
to you later. Just gonna interrupt this. Bye-bye now. Ciao.
Take care, everybody. Those of you who'd like to contribute to the Lara Technology Fund.
No, I just didn't realize there was a mute
it's
button on the
Lara.
thing.
It's the teaching Lara about technology.
Hey.
Yes.
You've been listening to the
Look at
Papers
that button.
Podcast. We hope we made you just slightly smarter.
How am I supposed to know it's on?
The podcast is a production of the Unit for Teaching and Learning at the Karolinska Institutet. The executive producer today was my friend Teresa Sörö. The technical producer today was Samuel Lundberg. You can learn more about the Papers Podcast and contact us at www.thepaperspodcast.com. Thank you for listening, everybody, and thank you for all you do. Take care.